Good morning, friends. It's Saturday, and I'm back with Chapter 20 of my upcoming book, Campaign at Fort Stix. Now it's time to grab a snack, dim the lights, and let me take you into the mists of time with a story I call Independence Day. In the light of the waning full moon, my uncle dropped me off at home on the 3rd of July. He waved and watched as I entered the front door of the house into my room on the front porch. I closed the door and watched through the curtains as he backed up and headed out of our driveway. He and my aunt had made reservations at a hotel for the next couple days, as he planned to spend 4th of July in Indiana with the family. I stumbled into the house, sleepy from the long drive, and immediately noticed my father on the couch snoring. There were several empty moonshine jugs and signs there had been a large gathering prior to my arrival. Full ashtrays and empty potato chip bags lay about the room amidst at least 10 folding chairs arranged in a semicircle before the couch. Obviously, he'd been having fun without me in my absence. I made a mental note to talk to him about this as I headed to the bathroom. On my way back to my room, I noticed my mother's door was closed and the lights were off in the kitchen and dining room. The room I shared with my brother was still open, and Mark was fast asleep with a cat curled up on the bed beside him. I turned off the living room light and climbed onto my couch after kicking off my shoes. I did not shower, nor did I change into pajamas. Snuggled in my old comforter, I closed my eyes to end the weekend. Rising with the sun, I went out to the kitchen to find something to eat. My father was no longer on the couch, and the house was filled with the smell of coffee and cigarettes, so I knew he was up. Of course, my mother was not in the kitchen cooking breakfast as my aunt had done. She was still sleeping. I poured and drank a small glass of milk as I stood looking out the window. My father was in the backyard, tending a fire on a large grill he had constructed from a 55-gallon barrel. On the picnic table nearby lay a pig with a piece of pipe sticking out both ends. A long cut down the length of its body had been sewed up with wire, and it was rubbed all over with spices. He really was going to roast a whole pig. Cool! It was a generally known fact that I was in charge of the adventures and misadventures department, and my father was in charge of fire and meats. I grabbed a few biscuits out of the tin and went out to see my dad. He was acting really strange. Every time a bird flew over, he would duck, despite the bird being much too high to pose a threat, and then he would mumble something about them not flapping their doggone wings so loudly. I found this strange, but not nearly as strange as when he finally looked over at me after I'd been talking to him for at least 10 minutes. He closed and rubbed his eyes, looked away, and then back again, before mumbling something about I was not really here because I was in Wisconsin, and about these dang hallucinations. Then he headed off to the house without ever saying a word to me. I walked to the back of the yard to look out at my garden. It was not nearly as overgrown as I thought it would be, and in fact, there were only a few small weeds in the rows. The plants looked healthy as well, and there were large red tomatoes, fat green peppers, and other things ready to pick. The corn silks were even mostly brown, letting me know it would not be long before I would be enjoying fresh corn. Walking along the fence toward the garage, I watched my dad come out of the house drinking from his coffee cup. In the other hand was a coffee pot, and he immediately filled the cup again after drinking. Then he saw me walking toward the garage and began to drink straight from the pot. I went around the corner toward the chicken coop as he drained the pot. It wasn't until years later that I understood the seriousness of his moonshine hangover. The chickens, ducks, and even the turkeys seemed happy to see me as I looked through the wire mesh. They had grown a bit in the last week, and instead of little yellow puffballs, they now had real feathers and were getting tall and lanky. Some of them were even sitting on the roosting bars we built for them. I got some feed from the garage and made sure their water tanks were full. Returning to the garage with the feed scoop, I noticed several of the boards over the bee nest were now laying on the ground. I knew I had nailed them back in place after returning the honeycombs. Looking closer, there were no bees inside the wall anymore, and the honeycombs were drying out. Where had the bees gone? Now that there were no more bees, I knew there would be no more fresh honey. I put the feed scoop back in the garage and noticed my bike sitting against the wall. There was dust on it, and I realized I had not ridden it for several weeks. Even before I left for Wisconsin, I had been so busy playing with snakes, bees, and building Fort Stix that it had been neglected. I told myself that would change soon. The compost tea barrel was still 3/4 full when I raised the lid. As I reached in to get a pitcher of tea for the garden, the smell hit me and caused me to gag. Surely this would be great for the plants. I poured a little at the base of each plant and then grabbed a medium-sized tomato and a cucumber before turning on the water. The fresh vegetables tasted great, and I knew my efforts at gardening were all worth it. Walking across the back of the garage toward the field, I stopped to peek into the old smokehouse. No one had done anything with it since we moved in, and the old meat hooks hung from the ceiling. As I left there and headed for Fort Stix, it occurred to me that I could tell my cousins a little story about the smokehouse. The door to Fort Stix opened easily, and I looked inside. There were no wasps nor hornets, and it seemed safe to enter. I sat on the bucket and opened the windows to let some fresh air and sunlight in. My cousins had a great farm, but they did not have a fort that I was aware of. Surely if they had one, they would have been as eager to show it to me as I was to show mine to them. I watched my dad messing around at the grill. He'd already placed the pig inside, and I could see the metal pipe sticking out each end. On one end, there was a handle, and he used this to turn the pig a quarter turn before locking it in place by putting a piece of broomstick under the handle. Then he lit a cigarette and sat back at the picnic table looking in an hourglass. When the hourglass finished draining the sand, he turned the pig another quarter turn and sat back down. I guess the hourglass must have been for 15 minutes. I found myself wondering what Mark was doing and if he even realized I was back from Wisconsin. I left the fort and headed for the front door to see if I could find him. I also wanted to see how the butterflies were doing in the terrarium. The screen door slammed shut behind me as I headed for our room. Mark was not on his bed, nor on my big bed. Looking at the terrarium, I was dismayed to see the lace covering was gone, and so were all my butterflies. I walked over to inspect it closer. Not only were the butterflies gone, but the entire piece of carpet was gone too. It was completely empty. "Hey, Kevin, what you doing?" Mark said behind me. "Where are the butterflies?" I asked. "How come the cage is empty?" "Mom said they were eating the cloth and going all over the house," Mark said. "She made me catch them all and put them outside because she said they were going to eat the curtains and our clothes." "So where'd you put them?" I asked. "Show me." He led the way out the front door and took me to a barrel on the side of the house over by the garage. It was the burn barrel where Dad burned trash. He pointed inside. I looked inside, but there was only ash. Apparently, the carpet and any caterpillars that were left had been burned with the trash. I walked back to the house with Mark following closely. First the bees, now the butterflies. We went into the front porch and I put a record on the player as I sat on the couch. Mark disappeared into the house as I began to listen to a symphony. I liked all kinds of music, but I found that classical music had the power to make me feel things and make me feel better when I was down. As I listened to the cannons going off in the music, I was thirsty and headed for the kitchen to get a drink. Hopefully, Mom made a pitcher of punch. Then I remembered that I made a jug of root beer and started to get excited. It should be ready by now. I opened the cabinet where I hid the root beer jug and was immediately hit by a rancid, sour smell. Reaching in to grab the jug, it was all sticky, and when I got it into the light, I could see that it had overflowed. Then I remembered that I was supposed to put it into the refrigerator on the second day to stop the fermentation. I was playing in a hayloft in Wisconsin that day. I dumped the noxious black mixture down the sink and rinsed out the bottle. Putting dishwashing liquid inside, I swirled it with hot water to wash it out and then washed the outside. My first attempt at root beer was a rousing failure, but I would not be deterred. I would make another batch soon. I put the jug back with my other jugs and went outside to see if my dad was doing any better. He had the grill open, and the pig was starting to look light brown on the outside now. Even though I knew it was not nearly done, it was starting to smell really good. My dad still did not say anything to me, and I wandered off toward Fort Stix. I was wondering about fireworks and what would be happening when everyone came for the party. Hearing a vehicle on the driveway, I looked out to see a yellow Chevy van pulling up by the house. It was my Uncle Al and Aunt Brenda. I watched as they piled out of the van and headed toward my father at the back door. My two cousins, Angelo and Anthony, were looking all around and stopped to look at the chicken coop, poking a finger in through the mesh to touch the chickens. I realized this was the first time they'd been here and emerged from my fort to greet them. "Careful, chickens and turkeys like to peck at little fingers," I said just as Anthony jerked his hand back to look at it. "Yeah, see? They like little wiggly things." Anthony looked at his finger and stuck it in his mouth. It was not bleeding nor even scratched. Angelo stuck his hands in his pockets and grinned. Angelo was 2 years younger than myself, and Anthony was the same age as my brother Mark. I grabbed a grasshopper from a nearby weed and handed it to Anthony. "Here, toss this in there and watch," I said. He tossed in the grasshopper, and we watched as the chickens immediately pounced on it en masse. Just as one would peck at it to get the tasty treat, another would also attempt to get it, and they would bump heads as the grasshopper bounced away from them. This continued for several minutes until one of the turkeys pushed its way through and snatched the bug. It ran off to a corner to eat the grasshopper while the rest of the birds ran after him. We laughed and headed over to the table where my aunt had set down a couple of bowls covered in foil. One had Spanish rice, and the other was full to the top with deviled eggs. I waited until everyone was looking the other way and snatched a deviled egg, one of my favorites. Mark came out for a minute to see what was happening, and while I was plotting to get another one of those delicious eggs, he disappeared with Angelo and Anthony. Another vehicle pulled into the drive. This time, a sharp-looking chopped pickup truck with shiny mag wheels and a custom paint job. I recognized the paint job as I had masked the truck when my dad painted it. It was my uncle's friend. He climbed out of the truck carrying a case of beer and a bunch of small green bananas I later learned were called plantains. I wondered what the bananas were for until I saw my uncle and father lift the pig out of the grill. They set it on a bed of foil on the table, and I watched as they unsewed the belly and stuffed it full of plantains. My uncle's friend was loudly proclaiming that they had never tasted anything as good as pig stuffed with roasted green plantains. I like bananas, so I wasn't against it, but I still wondered if they belonged in barbecue. About that time, my Aunt Brenda went into the house to find my mom, her sister. Then, my great-aunt Florence came walking up the hill from her house as my grandfather stepped out of the trees on the path to our backyard. They all merged around the grill at the same time. "Hey, Kevin, glad you're home," Grandpa said as he tousled my hair. "I watered your garden while you were gone. You have some really nice plants, and the corn is almost ready to pick. Be sure and bring me a few ears when it's ready." "Thanks, Grandpa," I said, smiling. "I'll be sure to save you the best corn." I turned back in time to see Aunt Florence rounding everyone up to help her get the tables and chairs out of the shed. The plan was to set up the picnic area on her driveway. Since I was still fairly small, I was volunteered to watch the pig roast and instructed to turn it a quarter turn each time the hourglass ran out. I had just turned the pig and turned the hourglass over when I heard another vehicle coming into the yard. It was my grandpa's truck, followed by my Uncle Pete in his car. They climbed out and gathered with my father and Uncle Al where they were setting up tables and chairs. My cousins stood by the vehicles for a minute or two before heading toward the grill when they saw me. "Hey, Kevin," Cousin Mark said as they walked up. "What are you doing?" I looked at the timer and saw I still had a couple minutes before I had to turn the pig. "Ah, nothing," I said nonchalantly. "Just roasting a big old pig." "Really? Wow," Michael said. "Can I see it?" "Sure," I beamed and opened up the grill. "That is so cool," Mark said, looking at the pig. I grabbed a knife from the table and trimmed a little piece of meat that was hanging off where it was sewed shut and put it on the table. Then, looking at the hourglass, it was time to rotate, so I moved the handle a quarter turn and closed the lid. I turned over the hourglass and then cut the piece of meat into smaller pieces. I tasted a piece and popped it in my mouth. The pork belly was so good. "Wow, your dad really does let you cook," Mark said. "Papa does not like for us to be close to the grill because he's afraid we'll get burned." "You just got to be careful," I said. "The grill is really hot, but as long as you're careful, you're okay." I ate another piece of the meat and then offered them some. We all enjoyed the fresh roasted pork belly. Then I reached over and grabbed another deviled egg. "Aunt Brenda made the deviled eggs," I said, taking a bite. "You guys should try them." We stood around the table for a minute, munching eggs, and I grabbed the last crispy piece of pork belly. Then I saw my dad, Grandpa, and uncles headed toward the grill. "You boys back up from the grill," Uncle Peter said as he walked up. "And go easy on the eggs, guys," Uncle Al said. "There has to be enough for everybody." My dad walked up and opened the grill to show my uncles. Then, just like I did, he cut off a piece and laid it on the table while he basted the pig with his special barbecue sauce. We moved off toward the porch and watched as my dad shared the piece of meat with them. It was like seeing ourselves in the future. I looked around to see if my brother and other cousins were about, but they were not. "Hey, Paul," I said. "Mark, Angelo, and Anthony are in the house. Run and tell them it's time for the big meeting in the fort, and we will see you there." Paul grinned and ran off into the house. Mark, Michael, and I headed back toward the driveway and were crossing when we heard Grandma holler for us. "Hi, Huma," I said, running up to hug her. "What are you boys doing?" she asked. "Come, help me unload the truck." She led us to Grandpa's truck where we unloaded 2 cases of sodas and several large pans of food. When we were done, she gave us each a can of root beer and 4 more for my brother and other cousins. As she sat at the table to smoke, we headed off to the fort. Now, in the interest of safaris everywhere, I knew what was necessary to give all of my cousins a decent tour before entering the fort. Crouching low by the tall bushes that separated Aunt Florence's yard from the field, I shushed my cousins and pointed to the field. "We gotta be careful, boys," I said, pointing to the field. "There are wild beasts that live in this untamed country, and we gotta watch out for them. Stay close and follow me." I led them toward the trees on my aunt's side of the bushes until we reached an opening. Crouching low, I crept through the bush and waited for them to join me. Once everyone was there, we could see Fort Stix just 20 feet straight ahead. So I turned to the left and led them back down this side of the bushes to the tall weeds at the side of the driveway. Getting down low, I low-crawled through the tall yellow grass until I got to the outhouse where I crouched to wait for my team. One by one, they joined me, and then Michael spoke up. "I gotta pee," he said. "Where's the bathroom?" I grinned, reached up to open the outhouse door, and pointed inside. "There you go." He went in, and I let the door close behind him. A couple minutes later, he emerged with a funny look on his face, as if he'd seen a ghost. "I looked in the hole in there," he said, wrinkling his nose, "and there were turds in there. Then I could not figure out how to flush it." I laughed. "You don't flush an outhouse." We continued toward the garage through the high weeds and were met by my brother Mark and other 3 cousins. We gave them their root beer rations, but cautioned them not to open them until we got to Fort Stix. Moving through the highest of the grass near the garage, we stopped to assess the chicken coop. Finding all well there, we continued toward the back corner of the garage where I led them around the corner to the smokehouse. I told them all to wait while I scouted ahead and went to the smokehouse to open the door. Looking in, I made sure it was clear and then motioned them forward. "Okay, boys, come on," I said, grinning. "Wow, what are those big hooks?" Paul asked, pointing to them hanging from the ceiling. "That is where we hang traitors," I said seriously as I could manage. "Once we get done torturing them, then we light a fire in that barrel to smoke them till they disappear." I could barely keep a straight face as the younger cousins looked on in horror, and Michael and Mark grinned widely. They knew what a smokehouse was. Leaving the smokehouse, we started the long trek across the desert of the field. As we neared Fort Stix, I paused near a very large truck fender. "Okay, security, wake up," I said and lifted the fender. Several garter snakes looked up and I reached down to pick up the biggest one, about 3 feet long. "Captain Hiss," I said, looking at the snake, "these are my cousins, and they are authorized to enter the fort with me. Please advise the rest of your men." I turned the snake around so it could look at all of my cousins and then put it back under the fender. Laying the fender down gently, I led the way to Fort Stix. Opening the door, I turned to my cousins. "Okay, men, come on in," I said, and went in to sit on my bucket by the window. We popped the tops on our root beers, hanging the pull tabs on a nail by the window, and drank greedily. Soon a series of belches erupted from the gassy soda, except from my brother Mark. He tried to burp, but it would not come. Then he tried harder and burped from the wrong end. Laughing and crying out against the noxious gas cloud, we rolled from the fort and ran away in a large circle. We were still laughing when we heard a welcome sound coming from down by the tables. "Okay, boys, time to eat," one of my uncles called. We made our way to the tables and took our places with our families as we gawked at the variety of foods. There was potato salad, deviled eggs, Spanish rice, hamburgers, hot dogs, squash patties, bowls of salad and green beans, watermelons, cantaloupes, and several pies. Then, everyone turned to watch as my father and Uncle Al carried the pig to the table like tribesmen returning from a hunt. They set it down onto sheets of foil placed there and removed the pipe and wires. As the bananas fell out onto the foil, large pieces of meat fell from the bones. I got up and walked over to pull the tongue out and started to eat it as I heard it was one of the best parts. The feasting commenced, and I was surprised to find that my mild-mannered cousins were not so restrained. Loud country music was playing on the speakers from the house, and everyone was having a great time. I did notice, while I was enjoying my umpteenth slice of watermelon, that my Uncle Peter kept looking my way while in conversation with my grandmother and Uncle Al, but I thought nothing of it, as I was sure he was regaling them with the adventures I had so thoroughly enjoyed while on his farm. Hiding under the picnic table later that day, I overheard him ask my grandmother, "Why can't they just be happy to have a sparkler kept away from the body and clothes, and be satisfied with watching fireworks display at the municipal park by licensed and trained technicians?" I had just finished coring a hole in the watermelon, which sat in the center of the table, conveniently located over the unused umbrella hole, and inserted an M80. Upon hearing this, I asked myself, where's the fun in that? Then I lit a couple of smoke bombs to cover my exit from the area, and of course, the fuse on the M80. Smoke erupted from under the flowing bedsheet being used as a tablecloth, giving me the desired cover, and I hightailed it to the nearest clump of thick bushes to hide and watch. My aunts, uncles, and grandmother were all waving their arms around wildly as they scooted back from the table to escape the foul-smelling smoke as I waited patiently. It seemed to take forever, and then suddenly, boom! The watermelon showered everyone in seeds and wet red pulp. As with all great adventures, the pig roast 4th of July party began to wind down, and I noticed my compatriots were plumb tuckered out. Gathered under the old pear tree, they seemed content to lay in the grass, rubbing their full bellies and recanting the day's events. Obviously, they did not realize that the adventure did not end until possibilities for excitement had been exhausted. I lit a pack of firecrackers and threw them into their midst. Then darkness began to fall, and my dad, along with my drunk uncles and a few friends, proceeded out to the field in the vicinity of Fort Stix and began a fireworks show that I have never forgotten to this day. The show began modestly with shooting stars, whistling rockets, and Roman candles launched into the sky, and pinwheels nailed to trellis. But as time went on and each man tried to outdo the others, it became wild. At one point, all of them came running out of the field, except for my dad, who was walking calmly our way with a big grin. Arriving back where the rest of us were gathered, he picked up a jug of moonshine and took a long swallow. No sooner had he set it back down when there was a giant white flash and the world shook with a thunderous explosion as a giant mushroom cloud erupted from the center of the field. He had buried half a pound of black powder and set it off with a piece of cannon fuse. I have never in my life seen so many flashing colors of intense light, and I was almost disappointed when the police and firemen left that evening. I hope you enjoyed this look into the campaign at Fort Stix. That's all for now, but I'll be back again next week with another story, just for you. Until then, sleep well.